Hello and welcome to my November reading wrap up. I read 18 books in November, which apparently is just how much I read now because it's been a few months of this, so not complaining about that. I read 11 physical books, 10 of which were off of my physical TBR, which is a great accomplishment. I don't know how many audiobooks and ebooks I read, I didn't count them. My cat is actually asleep for once while I'm filming, so maybe I will be able to get through this whole video without her screaming. That would be wonderful, but I'm going to get into this because I have a lot of books to talk about, and I do not want this to be more than an hour long. The first book that I read in November was The Other Side of Summer by... I don't know who it's by. Let's say Amy Sherman Palladino. It's a Gilmore Girls book. It's a novelization of a couple of episodes from, I believe, the first season. Like 3 of them. I gave this 2 stars. This doesn't need to exist. Like, I could do like a full discussion on the flaws in this book, but it's a novelization of a TV show. If you care, you should watch the TV show because that is the form that like it's supposed to exist in, and it's just better in that medium. I think like my biggest issue with this book, well, there were a few, but it was just like it's all from Rory's perspective, and like if you've watched the show, you know that like Rory is a major character, but she is only like one portion of the show. So now imagine that like you're just cutting out all of the scenes that Rory's not in, and you lose a whole lot of important stuff and like really meaningful stuff that really pushes the show forward. And then it's just like summarized later so that you can, you know, follow along in the general story. It's just super limiting. So that was a weird choice for this. I guess because they were trying to make it more YA and more like about a high school girl, but you know, that's not what the show is. I don't get it. There were other flaws, but like, let's be real. It doesn't matter. It's a novelization of a TV show. It wasn't great. But it wasn't like as horrible as it could have been. So I'm keeping this just because I'm keeping it as like a keepsake for the show, which is why I got it. I didn't get it because I thought it was going to be a great book. I got it to be a cute little keepsake, which makes me happy. But you know, if this intrigues you at all, just go watch the show. Oh, should I describe this? It's Gilmore Girls. Gilmore Girls is a TV show about a mother and daughter who live their life. Yeah, it's just like they live in a small town and it's kind of like about their adventures in the small town, and the daughter is like very into reading, very smart, goes to like a fancy private school and wants to go to Harvard, and the mother is a single mom who got pregnant when she was 16, and it's really charming, really funny. And this is just a few episodes when the daughter is 16. Don't really recommend. The second book that I read was Before We Were Yours by Lisa Wingate. This is a historical fiction novel. Well, it's half historical fiction, half present day. The present day portion of the novel is about a young woman in a political family who is basically gearing up to take over for her father. I think it's set in North Carolina. I might have made that up. She's gearing up to take over for her father, and as his health might be failing, so like she's getting more into politics, she's getting more into the public eye, and her grandmother has Alzheimer's, and that's like very important as well. And then the historical part of the story is about a few siblings who wind up being kidnapped and essentially sold for adoption, as it was. And it's a really heart-wrenching, really sad book. I gave it 4 stars. I really liked it. This has gotten a lot of hype, and I meant to read it for the longest time, but it took me like forever to actually pick up a copy, and I'm so glad I did. This was wonderful. The strongest point of this book is the emotions. Like, Lisa Wingate does a fantastic job of playing on your emotions, and like when she wants to make you cry, you cry. I mean, I didn't cry that much because I was reading this at work, but like, you know, it was really heart-wrenching, really sad. Like, she does so good at playing up those emotions and making you feel things for the characters, and just like it mattered, you know. Like, it just, the story mattered. I think I didn't really love this as much as I was expecting to. Like, it was 4 stars, it was really great, and it made me like really emotional and stuff, which I loved, but I think it was more of like a hollow emotion. Like, the further I got from this book, like the less I cared, like very, very quickly. And I think it was because I didn't really like the present day narrative very much. I didn't like the main character, I didn't like the plot, I didn't like the romance. It had this weird like cheating vibe that really didn't need to exist. Like, it did nothing for the story. The romance was like super non-existent and just like kind of added cringe, which I don't know. It just seemed like a very unnecessary addition that did nothing but like make the book kind of less. But it was really interesting to learn about adoption at the time, like the selling of children from poor families into rich families. Like they would be kidnapped. Like in this book, they were kidnapped off their houseboat while their parents were at the hospital, and they were just sold to different families and like never found each other again. Like the parents frequently didn't find out what happened to them, and it's just like really heartbreaking and really sad. And Wingate actually included like a bunch of resources at the end of the book if you want to read more nonfiction about the topic, which I would really love to at some point, which really grateful for that. But it was a really good, really interesting book. If you like historical fiction, I would recommend it. Then I read The Likeness by Tana French. This is the second book in her Dublin Murder Squad series. This focuses on Detective Cassie Maddox, who works, I think, domestic violence now, but she gets called to the scene of a murder because the murder victim had actually stolen her undercover identification from like years before. And when she looks at the murder victim, she realizes that they look very, very similar. So she decides to go undercover as the murder victim and basically investigate the murder from the inside. I give this 3 stars. Tana French writes really wonderfully dense thrillers. Like, there's so much going on. I love the characters she develops. Like, they're so like unlikable, sometimes bland people, but like they feel so real, and it just creates such a rich story and a rich cast of characters. And like, I want to love her books so badly. But I'm sorry, she went undercover as a murder victim, like hanging out in the house with her roommates who she'd been best friends with for 3 years, and you're telling me they're not gonna notice that this is a completely different person? Like, I don't care how much they look alike. I cannot suspend my disbelief that much. Like, I really can't. And honestly, it's kind of a testament to how much I like Tana French's writing style that this got 3 stars, because this is an unbelievable premise. Like, I just cannot suspend my disbelief that much. Like, I know I have to in thrillers. Like, in most thrillers, you have to suspend your disbelief quite a bit, but I couldn't do it. Like, this never once felt real to me. I could not buy into that premise. I usually try to like get past things like that, but I didn't realize that's what this book was going in. So, if you would also struggle with that premise, I don't recommend. But I love her writing style. It's so like slow paced and dense and fascinating, and like I want to read more from her, even though I kind of dislike all the books I've read. They all have like something that just doesn't work for me, but I feel like she has a book out there that I will love. So I will keep reading her, but this thriller did not do it for me. Then I read The Girl Who Chased Away Sorrow, The Diary of Serenita, a Navajo Girl by Anne Turner. This is one of the Dear America books, which is a middle grade series that are essentially historical fiction diaries about various points in history. This one is about a Navajo girl during the Navajo removal in the 1860s. I gave this 2 stars. This is the first of the Dear America books that I have not enjoyed, and the first that I wouldn't recommend to either adults or children. Usually I quite like these. They're really enjoyable, quick, middle grade books. I read a lot of them when I was a kid, and I feel like they gave me a really good, like, general idea of history. Like, I learned a lot about, like, different points of history from these books, because, like, they're fiction, but, you know, they give you, like, general concepts of history that I wouldn't have known otherwise. But this one was not good. The historical aspects always felt kind of off to me when I was reading this, but I'm very ignorant of the Navajo removal and Navajo culture in general, so I didn't want to just like say that. So I read some other reviews and I did a little bit of research. Not much, but like just a touch. And it generally seems to be like the consensus that this is not a very good book. It does not have a very good portrayal of Navajo culture, the Navajo people, or the Navajo removal of the 1860s. Like, down from like the naming, her name is Serenita, which is not apparently a name that they would have had in the 1860s, to like other language in the book, to some events that happened. And also something I struggled with a lot was that this book did not seem as negative as it should have been. Like, with all the trauma and the bad things that are happening, like she's being separated from her parents, like people are being killed, like they're being marched around, like going hungry, like not having enough food, like people are dying around them, like people she's close with are dying, and like it wasn't written in a way where it was like, it kind of seemed less bad than it should have been, you know? Like, all these traumatic things are happening, and the book was like, oh, but she's gonna tell another story, so it's okay. And I was like, it's really not okay. And like, I've read other middle grade books, like in this series, that have dealt with very difficult topics in a way that's like appropriate for very younger readers, but also like dealt with it a lot better than this book did. And it was just like, this book focused a lot more on like the one white soldier who was like nice to them than it did the hundreds of other white soldiers who were just like indiscriminately murdering the Navajo people. So I struggled a lot with this, would not recommend it. Then I read Know My Name by Chanel Miller, which is a nonfiction memoir of this woman's account of being sexually assaulted. She was the victim in the Stanford rape case, which was very well known a few years back. It was the case that involved Brock Turner, and this is just her memoir of essentially what happened, what she experienced. It's a lot about after the fact, like going through the trials, going through the media attention, and how that affected her. And it's just a really wonderful book. It's just her account of like her life and what she's feeling. I gave it 5 stars. This is stunning. Like, it's one of those books that's just so wonderfully written and so powerful and so emotional, and just I cried through so much of this book. Like, this is one of my favorite books of the year. It's one of the best books I've read in a very, very long time. Like, I cannot recommend this enough if it's something that you think you can read, because it is very, very difficult to get through. It's so emotional. Like, her telling of this story is just so wonderfully written. Like, the words she uses, the way she speaks. She offers criticisms of the justice system, and she offers hope for what she went through, and everything she says resonates so much with me. And like, I just cannot speak highly of this book enough. Like, I cannot just coherently talk about this, because it is just about the emotion. It's about what she went through, and it's just how painful it was for her, and she does such a fantastic job of illustrating that pain in a way that, like, as the reader, you feel some of it. Like, not all of it, obviously, just like some of it, and that little bit that you feel is enough to just like hurt so bad. Like, I highly recommend this. Like, it's such a wonderful book. I think people will learn a lot if they don't know a lot about the justice system and how rape victims are treated in it. I think you should read it. I think it does a lot to educate people on the justice system and like what women go through, not just in the justice system, but in life after being assaulted, and like how it affects people. And it's fantastic. This is such a wonderful book. Like, 5 stars all around. Like, I have no criticisms of this, except that I don't know if I could ever reread it, because it was very, very difficult. I need something a little bit lighter after Know My Name, so I picked up Holidays on Ice by David Sedaris, which is supposed to be like, I mean, it's a really short book. It's just a couple of essays. He's a humor writer. He writes nonfiction. So this is just a collection of essays that he wrote that are all kind of holiday focused, like mostly like Christmas. I gave this 2 stars. David Sedaris is a little bit hit or miss for me in general. Sometimes I find him very amusing and interesting, and a lot of the time I find him very annoying. This book somehow managed to surpass both of those and just go into the range of, this was truly awful to read. It was a terrible experience. I would not recommend. I didn't like any essays in this. His most famous essay is the Santaland Diaries. I think that was one of the things that got him more famous. And that was like the only essay in this that was sort of worthwhile. But even then, it's like, that essay is about him working as an elf at Macy's for the Santa family pictures. It's the only one in here that has any merit whatsoever. And even that was a kind of gross essay, because he talks about like one of the perks of the job being that he gets to see half-naked teenagers changing into their elf costumes, and like he's in his 30s as he's working this job, and I'm like, gross, dude. Like, he's talking about like high school and college students, like some of them could be minors. Like, oh, it was so gross. And then he used a bunch of slurs at one point, and I was just like, I don't know, like, it wasn't a terrible essay, but also like he was just writing about customer service and working retail essentially. And like, as someone who works retail, basically everything he said in this book was kind of like average retail stories. Like, there was nothing that was particularly over the top or funny. It was kind of just like, yeah, like, these are my daily interactions. Like, I don't know, I've read funnier retail stuff, and that wasn't. And then the other essays in this were so much worse. Like, there was fiction in here. Like, he wrote like these fictional kind of satirical, I guess, short stories maybe, that like I didn't know what they were doing. He had one essay or a short story, I don't know. I have to read this because I've completely just like repressed it. That was in the form of a Christmas card. There was a woman writing this Christmas card, and her husband like found out that he had an illegitimate half Vietnamese daughter, and also the woman's first grandchild was born addicted to like crack cocaine. And like, it was kind of like, just from her perspective, writing this card in the vein of like, oh, I'm writing a Christmas card to like update you on everything that's happened this year. And like, it was really racist, which was the point, but also just like really cringy, and it wasn't funny, and it didn't like do anything. Like, it went places, but it went places without doing anything, and like, I genuinely did not understand. And then another was about a family, again, short story, I think, who were like a wealthy family who was like trying to constantly like one up their neighbors in terms of giving, and like they would like give gifts to their children, and they would start giving like their house away and giving organs away and giving their children away, and like eventually they were like homeless on the street giving away like their hearts and like dying. And I, again, don't understand the point. Like, I mean, I get what he was doing kind of, but like, it wasn't funny. Like, I don't understand this book. It was terrible. I had a really bad time reading it. Just Mercy by Bryan Stevenson. This is a nonfiction book about a lawyer who is essentially a death penalty lawyer. He started the, what was it called? The Equal Justice Initiative, which essentially defends people who've already been convicted of crimes, who are in prison, most of whom are either on death row or in prison for life, and most of whom haven't had like a good defense, who don't have the money to hire lawyers to put their case through appeals, who like didn't have good lawyers, who had like mitigating circumstances to their cases that like weren't explored in court. And like, some of them are children, some of them are mentally disabled, like some of them are innocent. This book focuses on both Bryan Stevenson's life and his organization in general. That's like half the story. And then the other half of the story is about this man, Walter McMillian, who was on death row for the murder of a young white woman. He's a black man in the 80s, I believe. And he's on death row and he's innocent. And Bryan Stevenson like takes on his case and fights for this man and eventually gets him out of prison. And it tells the story of that and just like the Equal Justice Initiative in general, and like covers a lot of their variety of cases. I gave this 5 stars. This is amazing. Like, this is such a fantastic book. Like, I loved learning about him and his work and what he does, because I am very against the death penalty, as he is. Like, that's not the point of this book. It's about just like defending people who need to be defended. And he talks a lot about like the different cases he has. Like, yes, Walter McMillian is kind of the case study for this book, and I get why he chose him, because he was an innocent man. Like, he did not commit this murder. He didn't commit any crimes, really, as far as I could tell. And like, he was an innocent man. That makes him an easy case study. But it also talks about the children he defended, like children who set fires that killed people by accident and got life in prison when they were like 14. Or like people who like did commit murders, but like he still defends them because they shouldn't be on death row. Like, they need to be defended. Like, he defends anyone he can, and like he does such great work. This is a wonderful book. I really love reading about the law. I think it's fascinating. And there's definitely enough in there that, like, I can see why someone else might struggle a little bit with this. If you find anything that's, like, legal kind of dry and boring, I found this fascinating. There's so much emotion in this. I cried a little bit, not very much. It's not really intended to be, like, a very heavy crying book. It's more informative and very, very fascinating. I highly recommend this if you're interested in the justice system or prison reform, or like just in general trying to educate yourself on like some of the flaws in our current system and some of the things that could be done better, because this offers so much information. It's so well done. It's so fascinating. Like, this was 5 stars, absolutely fantastic. Like, again, one of the best things I've read this year or in a long time. Like, right up with Chanel Miller's book. I read these for my reading the highest rated books on my TBR video, which I'll link down below. People are not wrong. This is a stunning book, so I highly, highly recommend you give it a go. All Good People Here by Ashley Flowers. This is an adult thriller about a young woman who's a reporter, and she winds up going back to her hometown to take care of her uncle who has Alzheimer's, and there is a murder of a child nearby, and that murder reminds her of the case when she was a young girl. Her neighbor was killed and found just in a ditch not far from the house. No one ever found out who did it. A lot of people blame the parents. It is very, very reminiscent of the JonBenet Ramsey case. And then essentially it's just her being a journalist and investigating stuff and taking care of her ailing uncle. I gave this 2 stars. I liked the premise kind of before I realized how similar it was going to be to the JonBenet Ramsey case. Didn't love it. For starters, I don't like when thrillers are so similar to cases that are like real, especially like unsolved. Like, it feels exploitative. Like, it really does, and it rubs me the wrong way. And it's also just like, even if you disregard that, even if it doesn't bother you, it's so boring to read a thriller about a case that's been discussed as in depth as the Ramsey case has. Like, pretty much everyone who's at all interested in true crime has heard of that case, has heard all the many theories about that case, and it's just like, I did not need to read a whole book about like a thinly veiled fictional version of that case. But beyond that, this book wasn't so bad as much as it wasn't like anything at all. Like, I could not sit here and tell you everything that I disliked about this book. Like, there were a bunch of things about this book that weren't well done. I didn't love, what was my list? So I can actually go through it, because I don't remember. I forgot in this book. The dual timeline was okay. The characters were okay. The plot twists were kind of like underwhelming, but not terrible. The investigation is kind of dry. The connections that Margot makes between cases are kind of like stretching a little bit, but like none of that was like terrible. Like, I couldn't sit here and critique them as like, those are the reasons why this book was bad. It's just that like there was nothing good about this either. It was just kind of nothing. Like, it contributed nothing. It held my attention enough that I got through it very quickly, and that's like the best thing I can say about it. But like, I wouldn't recommend. Also, in reviews, there's a lot of complaints about the ending of this book, because this book kind of like stops abruptly. Just like, it just stops at like a major point, and it kind of lacks closure in a little bit, and then like, it's weird because it lacks closure in like the main part of the story, and then it just holds your hand through all the details of a different part of a story. Like, here's what happened, let's explain every tiny minuscule moment of it, and then the other half of the story is just like, you get nothing, which was weird, because it was kind of like open-ended in a way that I could have dealt with had it not been for the second element, which was weird. I don't know. I did not like this. This will be unhauled, which is unfortunate because it was a birthday gift, but like, I did not enjoy this one. The Road Home by Ellen Emerson White. This was the last book that I read for the reading the highest rated books on my TBR, and she is my favorite author, so I'm really glad that her book was included. This is a companion to the Echo Company series. The Echo Company is about a company in Vietnam during the Vietnam War. This group of boys really are fighting over there. They're Americans, and basically just follows them over like a couple months in Vietnam. there is a character in those books named Rebecca who is a nurse in Vietnam. And this follows her from like her last months in Vietnam to when she comes home, her transition into coming home from being in a war zone, and also her just like dealing with all the trauma that she's experienced because of the war, like seeing all these young boys who are dying, who are like, she's 21 and most of them are younger than her. So this is a historical fiction. I guess it's billed as young adult, but it's really more like a new adult novel because all the characters are like 20s basically. But this is wonderful. I gave this 5 stars. I loved every second that I was reading this. I love Ellen Emerson White. I love her writing style. I talk about her all the time, so I highly recommend reading her books. I just sobbed through this entire book, like from start to finish. I'm not sure I ever got like 50 straight pages without crying because I was just ugly sobbing this entire time. It was so wonderful. I love Rebecca as a character. I love that they actually delve into her trauma and like what she went through. It's not glossed over in any way. Like so much of this book is just about her coping, or you know, not coping, as the case may be. Like she went over there to help people and she saved lives, but also she worked triage in the emergency room in a hospital in Vietnam, which means she basically condemned people to die because she looked at them and were like, they're gonna die regardless of what we do, so we need to save the ones we can. Like that was her job. And that's so hard and so traumatic for someone who's just like a year out of nursing school, basically. It's so sad. It's so charming. It's so like happy. It has its really happy moments. Like she connects with some people that she knew over in Vietnam, like a soldier that she knew who was an amputee, like her captain, I think captain, who was one of the nurses over there. And like you see her dealing with her family and her brother who went off and basically hid out in Canada when he got drafted, and it's fantastic. Everything about this book is fantastic. I cannot recommend this enough. Like, I ugly cried. The only thing that I have would criticize about this book, now that I have like a little bit of space from it that I can kind of think about it logically, it was a little bit fast-paced for me, which I constantly complain about. But this book covered such a long period of time. It covered her last few months in Vietnam, her like month at home when she was like recuperating, and then she goes and spends like several months still working for the army because her tour is not up yet, and then she like goes on a road trip after all of this. And it's like a lot of time, and it is a very thick book, don't get me wrong, but it could have been slowed down a little and I think it would have been better for it. But 5 stars, amazing, one of my favorites. So I'm so happy I finally got to this. Then I read Brown Girl Dreaming by Jacqueline Woodson. This is a middle grade memoir in verse about her life growing up in, I believe, North Carolina and then New York as a young black girl, and just like what her life was like, what she experienced. It's really lovely. It turns out this was a reread for me, which I'd forgotten that I'd read it. I mean, I realized like immediately that it was a reread, but I still read it anyway because it was wonderful. 4 stars. This is just a lovely lyrical book. I don't know, it's really hard for me to like critique poetry. It captures a lot of her childhood memories so well and so like viscerally. It's a little bit disjointed, but kind of like on purpose, because it is like a memoir in verse. It is like you get these separate poems that are all like gorgeously written, but it's like sometimes the connections between them are a little bit like, you know, you get this poem and that poem and that poem, and they're all like chronological about her life, but like it's not always the smoothest transition, which is kind of just like what you get in a book like this, and I liked it. It's wonderful. I highly recommend reading it. I don't know. It's hard for me to review poetry because like I'm not really a poetry person in the way that I am a prose person. I like it sometimes, but it's hard for me to talk about. God, I'm looking at these thrillers that I read and I just do not remember them at all. Like I'm having to like not just look at my review, but actually look at the summary for this. So I read The Quiet Girl by S.F. Kosa. This is about a man who goes to track down his new wife. They had an argument and she kind of went up to their cabin to like go write by herself and stop responding to his text messages. So he's like, okay, I'll go like make up with her and apologize for the fight. and she's not there. So he calls the police, they start looking for her, and he starts really trying to investigate himself because the police are like, she's an adult, she probably just like left you. So he's looking into her past, he's interacting with her parents who she's estranged from, and he's finding more secrets about her that he didn't know about. I gave this 3 stars. I mostly found it like really disjointed and choppy. Like it didn't flow super well for me. It was really hard for me to get into. Like the first like half of this book, I was just really struggling to care and like be involved in this story. And like, I don't know, I wanted to like be invested, and I just like, it couldn't keep my attention. And then it got better, but it was still like, I hate when authors include the like, it was all a dream trope, or whatever variation of it. Essentially there's a story in this that is fictional that you don't know at the beginning, and then it's revealed like it's not really a plot twist, it's more of like you find it out a little bit later. But it's so annoying to me to get invested in something and just be like, oh well, that's made up, it's not real. And like it always takes me out of a book because it's just like I spent all this time caring about something that wasn't real. Like it feels cheap to me. But the second half was like better. You started figuring out like more of what was going on, which got me more invested. It took too long to get there, but like there are some good drama. I like some good drama. And the ending was super depressing, which like I feel like is a plus. Again, if you're okay with the depressing ending. But like it was a plus because it was like, it was depressing because I did care a bit, and like it made me care, and like it made me depressed, and like I want to feel something, so I'll give it that. Not like a great thriller, but it was like a fine 3-star. Like I read it, I forget it very fast, but like it was a good time. And then I read Final Girls by Riley Sager, which is my first Riley Sager book. This is a thriller about a young woman who in her teens was basically made a final girl. She was at a cabin and all of her friends were murdered, and she's the only one who survived, and she doesn't remember what happened at that cabin. But now as an adult, she found out that one of the other final girls who basically experienced the same thing has been murdered, and she's like, oh no, like what do we do? Like, does this have anything to do with me? Like, are they coming after final girls? And like no one knows who murdered her, and it's kind of just like her living her life and just like her fear and like her trauma of what happened. And you also get like flashbacks to like that night in the cabin and like what happened. It was interesting. 4 stars. Kind of a light 4 stars. This book you had to suspend your disbelief a lot for. Like a lot. You could not, like nothing in this was really believable. The ending was ridiculous and absurd, but like honestly it was a fun time for me. I had a good time reading it. Like it was one of those books that I'm like, this was not an amazing book, but I had fun, so I enjoyed it. I don't know that I'll be reading more Riley Sager after this. I feel like this was the one that intrigued me, and I feel like now this was enough for me. Like, I don't think any of his other books are going to be as good just based on my personal taste and interest, but like, I'm glad I read it. I kind of wish it had been a little more realistic, like more believable. Like, I would have liked to really buy into it, and I would have liked for them to delve more into the main character's trauma of like what she went through, because her trauma is discussed, but it's more like vague, like, oh yeah, she's very traumatized and anxious and now she takes Valium a lot, instead of actually like dealing with what she felt. So I don't know, it had some flaws. It was not a perfect book, it was very flawed, but like it was fun, and really that's what I'm looking for in a book like this. And then I read The Dry by Jane Harper, which is the first book in the Aaron Falk series. This is a thriller that's set in Australia. Basically, a cop goes back to his hometown because one of his childhood friends has killed his family and himself, so they're doing like a triple funeral, and he starts feeling like something's not right here, that like he doesn't believe that this is necessarily what happened. So he starts investigating the crime and uncovering more secrets in the town. And there was also a death that occurred when he was a teenager in the town that kind of like precipitated his leaving as a teenager. And it's kind of just like about his experiences in this very like petty, insular, small rural town in Australia. It's very interesting. I gave it 4 stars. I love Jane Harper. I discovered her in like September and she's so wonderful. I'm reading like all of her books right now, and this is maybe one of the better ones. I will say this was a little bit too similar to The Lost Man. I wish I'd read them further apart because they do have a lot of like similar themes and such, but this was fantastic. She does such a good job of just capturing this small town vibe and like the feelings of hopelessness that kind of arise in a situation as what happened in this book. Her characters are so complex and interesting. Like, they're kind of the reason to keep reading in her books. Like, it's about the characters. Like, these mysteries are happening. Like, these bad events are happening around them, but you're really following the character's journey. Like, that is the driving force, and it's so wonderful. They're so complex and like such fascinating people, and there's so much to learn about them, and it's just wonderful. And then her writing style is stunning. Her plots are like actually very interesting. Like, you're not reading it to find out what happened or for like the scare factor or whatever. Like, you're reading it because it's so fascinating and draws you in, and like I get really invested in the story in a way that like most thrillers don't for me. So I love this. I would highly recommend. It is a very slow-paced thriller. Her stories are very like slow and drawn out, and like you kind of like get into the character's head and like deal with them as people in these complex situations. It's not like big and dramatic and fast-paced and fun like Riley Sager is, but this is wonderful. If it sounds like it might be your kind of thing, I 100% recommend picking her up. Then I read Conquest of the Ten, which is the third book in the Constellation Saga by Kay MacLeod. This follows a group of young adults, mostly in their 20s or late teens, who have superpowers. They're basically a second generation of superheroes. They kind of, it's a high fantasy book. They inherited these magical abilities from their parents, essentially to fight an invading force. The Tenebrae are essentially parasitic beings who destroy the worlds that they're on in order to use their magic. And to survive, they have to use the life force of other things. So they destroyed their world, and now they're looking at Lucidia, which is the world these characters live in. And they have to defend their world from these Tenebrae. I gave this 3 stars. It's a wonderful high fantasy series. I had such a good time reading them. There will be more. This is just the last one that's been published, but I had a really fun time reading them. I think this is the lowest rated book that I've had in this series, because I do feel like this book had a few pacing problems for me. It was just like much too fast paced. Like, there were too many characters and too many events taking place for like the space that happened in this book. There were some very important things that happened off the page, which was kind of weird for me. Like, they would just come in and be like, oh yeah, this happened and we solved that problem over there, but like it's fine now. And it was just kind of like, it needed more time. Like, this book easily could have been like 600 or 700 pages, and I think it would have been a whole lot better for it. But this book really relies on the characters a lot. The characters are the driving force. Like, it's a very character-driven fantasy, and like they're all so distinct and such interesting people, and the relationships are really well crafted, and it's a wonderful series. This book is like my least favorite of the 3, but I think overall the series is very worth reading. Then I listened to, via audiobook, Invisible Women, Data Bias in a World Designed for Men by Caroline Criado Perez. This is a nonfiction book that's essentially about the gender data gap, how the world is essentially crafted for men in a lot of different ways. Like, she discusses transportation, she discusses medicine, she discusses like car design, like really like everything. It's a very like broad book, lots of statistics, and it's basically just how the world is designed for men. And because men have frequently been the people in power when things are being designed, women's needs and women's differences aren't really taken into consideration. And it's not an intentional thing, it's more of just because the people in power are designing the system, they design it for themselves and their own needs and not the needs of other people. And it kind of just covers a very broad spectrum. I gave this 3 stars. It had a lot of interesting statistics and a lot of really like interesting and worthwhile information. It's very like fact-based. She goes on like she has chapters that focus on different things. Like, there was one whole chapter about medicine and basically how, like, women aren't included in a lot of, like, early trials of drugs. And it's like, well, how do we know that these things affect women's bodies the same way they affect men's bodies? And, like, so on and so forth. There's a lot more information and a lot more in depth than I'm talking about here. But it was really well done in that regard. I do think sometimes she drew conclusions that, like, I'm not necessarily saying I disagreed with the conclusions she drew from the statistics she was talking about, but I kind of felt like she could have gone more in depth on, like, why she took this information and came to that conclusion. Sometimes it was kind of a leap for me. And again, not that I disagreed, I just kind of wish there'd been a little bit more discussion sometimes, instead of just like, here's the statistics, here's my conclusion, the end. But my biggest problem with this book was that I found it very ironic that she writes an entire book about the gender data gap and leaves out so many women. She basically never talked about trans women at all, like literally never mentioned them. And I don't think she ever really talked about LGBT plus women. I mean, apart from just trans women. I don't think she talked about them or any non-binary people, which was less so because, like, it was focused on women. But, like, never talked about lesbians or bi people, and it seemed, like, very ironic. Like, she found the gender data gap harmful enough to write an entire book about the harm that it causes. And yet, by excluding all of these women, she's perpetuating that gender data gap. And it was just like, why? Like, how did you write an entire chapter about bathroom usage and how it affects women differently across the world, and never once mention or discuss the problems that specifically trans women have? And it's just, I don't know. That's what kind of stopped me from really enjoying this book and highly recommending it. It's just like, how do you recommend a book about the gender data gap that continues to perpetuate the gender data gap? I don't know. It did have a lot of good information. I just wish it hadn't been so exclusionary, because it really makes me feel like, because this book is missing so much, I can't recommend it the way I would have liked to. But yeah, that was kind of why I gave it 3 stars. It was just like lacking for me. Then I listened to A Long Walk to Freedom by Nelson Mandela, which I actually listened to early in the month, but then it was due, which was why I had 2 audiobook finishes in a row. This is just his autobiography. He fought apartheid in South Africa and then became the first African president of South Africa. Or I guess the first black. I don't know if white South Africans were considered African at that time. But the first black man to be president of South Africa. And it's about the African National Congress and, like, how they fought against apartheid and the National Party and racism in South Africa, and the 27 years that he spent in prison, which is a lot, and then their first free election, which was the first election black people could vote in. And it's a very fascinating book about a great man. I gave this 4 stars. I think my main complaint is just that, like, it is a political autobiography, and, like, you know, by nature it's going to be very biased. He's not going to talk about, like, a lot of the negative things that he participated in, which, like, not judging him for that. Like, it was a literal war going on in South Africa. Like, he was a military leader. Like, bad things happen. Like, you have to do bad things to fight war. But, like, I wish there'd been more, just because, like, I am so ignorant of the situation. It's like, this is one perspective, and it made me want to read a lot more, because it was very, very interesting. And he did a good job of writing for an audience like me, of people who, like, we know who he is, we know, like, what he did. He was the first president and spent a lot of time in prison, but, like, maybe not a whole lot more than that. And he really did a good job of, like, explaining the politics in a way that was very easy to follow, and, like, the different laws, and, like, he was writing for an audience that, like, wouldn't necessarily have a depth of knowledge on South Africa and apartheid. So I really enjoyed it. I would highly recommend it. It's a very thick book, but worth the read. The audiobook, I'm not sure how much I would recommend. The narrator of the audiobook is American and does what I think is a South African accent for the book, which, like, I don't know why they wouldn't just hire a South African, but, like, his accent kept dipping in and out. Like, sometimes he, like, hella rolled his R's, like dramatically rolled them. And then sometimes he would use like the soft British R, and then sometimes it would just be like a standard kind of hard American R, and like, I don't know, like he just dipped in and out a lot, and it was kind of unpleasant to listen to this horrifically fake accent, but like just Irish South African maybe. But the book is really, really good. So you should definitely pick it up. And then the last physical book that I read was Murder on the Orient Express by Agatha Christie. This is a murder mystery. Essentially, a group of people are on a train, they get stuck in the snow, and a murder happens. And it's a locked room mystery. Like, the murderer has to be on the train, and Hercule Poirot investigates and interviews everyone and announces that he knows who the murderer is. I gave this 3 stars. I don't understand Agatha Christie, I think. I'm realizing that now. I want to, and I'm gonna keep reading her, but like, I just don't get it. This is kind of a terrible story. It's not really a story at all. It's a logic puzzle, and if you like logic puzzles, you will probably find it enjoyable. I did. It's just that the characters are not great. There's not a whole lot of character development. Everyone is kind of a caricature, and Poirot is just a smug asshole. Like, I'm not a fan of Poirot at all. Like, he's so annoying. He's just sitting here like, oh, have you discovered the mystery yet? Oh, you haven't? How odd, because I've known for 28 pages now. And it's so annoying. I'm not a fan of Poirot, apparently. This was my first Poirot novel. But I don't know. She doesn't have the cozy mystery vibe that I liked in her last book in this one. I just didn't get a whole lot out of it. Like, it wasn't a bad time. It just felt like overly long for what it was, and I didn't like the characters, and it was just very flat and logic puzzly. If you like logic puzzles, you should read this though, probably, because it was kind of fun as a logic puzzle. And then the last book I read this month was Force of Nature by Jane Harper, which is the second book in the Aaron Fox series. This follows the main detective from The Dry as he is investigating a different case that this time is actually part of his job. He is a cop, and he is investigating the case of a woman who went on a wilderness retreat with her business who did not come back from the retreat, and they're looking for her in the woods. And he was investigating her business for like money laundering and stuff, and she was his inside contact, so he is very concerned that this has something to do with the money laundering. So basically they interview all the different women who are involved in the wilderness retreat, who were there, and like what they were doing. There's a lot of like different stories going on, and everyone has secrets, and essentially that's just what happens here. I gave this 3 stars. This has been my least favorite Jane Harper book, and I think it's because it's the first book that's told from a perspective of a cop doing his job, and it doesn't have that personal connection that all of her other books have. They've all touched me really close emotionally. Like, you get invested in these people who are so close to the crimes that are happening, who are so involved in the communities where these crimes happened. And then this book, it's like, yeah, you have like all these people who are close to the crime, but the main character is an outsider who's kind of just like looking in and trying to arrest somebody. And I do like thrillers like that. It's just not the ones that Jane Harper writes. That's not where her strength is for me. Like, that's not what I get invested in her books. And it was like, this was still good. It just, I was a little bored because the personal connection is kind of the driving force for me. And it's really what I care about in these books. And without that, this book was fine, but it was just kind of dull. And I kept kind of waiting for something to happen. And like, not a bad book. I did give it 3 stars. I did enjoy it. I still think Jane Harper is a wonderful writer with really interesting, complex characters. I just wanted to care a whole lot more than I did. But I would still recommend it if you like Jane Harper books. Just maybe not as much as some of her other ones. So that was everything that I read in the month of November. Let me know down below if you've read any of those books and what you thought of them if you have. And as always, thank you so much for watching, and I will see y'all again soon.